Yes, of course it. Hmm?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Michael Mulryan Podcast. Hopefully, this podcast gives you some insight into some topics, helps you learn some new things, and overall just helps you improve as an individual person. And today, our very first guest is Professor, although he's not actually a professor, but I always refer to him as a professor, Thaddius Martin, Tad. Just a little background on Tad. He has been teaching for 29 years at different universities, mostly, at universities, colleges, but he has taught people in age ranges from 3 to 65. He's done tutoring, substitution, a little bit of special ed teaching, a lot of different stuff. And he went to Southern Connecticut State University, where he majored in English, and he stayed at Southern Connecticut State University, where he got his master's degree in English teaching. So first things first, I am curious, why'd you major in English? What was the reasoning behind that?
It's what I liked. I went off to college, did my freshman year, took my basic requirements, got into my sophomore year, and they started putting pressure on me to get a major. And, I knew that I had done well in my English classes and I had enjoyed them. I liked reading and discussing what I read. And I was never a huge fan of history. I was interested in history, but reading long historical documents was not my thing. So English seemed like the way to go. And, my English professors, thought that I would do well with it. And they said, yeah, you should major in English. And I said, okay, well, I guess that's what I'm doing.
Gotcha. And at your university back then, were there a lot of other English majors, or were you kind of like one of this lone wolves majoring in English?
No, there were a lot. There was a very different, at least among my friends, there was a very different approach to university. We didn't, for the most part, go in thinking about, okay, well, what should I major in? What do I want to do with the rest of my life? It was, this is university, this is what you major in, this is what you study, and then you might do something different after that. And I think the difference between your generation and mine is that, at full price per semester for me was $764. And in fact, I got a deal because my dad was a professor at the university, and according to the union contract, I could go for $10 a semester. So, when you're paying $10 a semester, you're not thinking to yourself, oh my God, I'm going to have these huge student loans, and I better get a job that makes over $65,000, because if I don't, I'll actually go backwards. So a lot of things affected the decision, but I think for my generation, the biggest thing that affected the decision was the fact that college was a whole lot less expensive. And that was true for, as far as I know, every single college out there. Even the expensive ones weren't anything like they are now. It really changed the picture. Your generation has to make decisions in a very different way than mine.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. I'm guessing, back then there also was much less debate about whether or not college was worth it, as the price was lower, right?
Yeah, I went for 4.5 years and it cost me $90. So you pay more than that to stay overnight in a hotel. So there's no debate on that one.
Yeah, I spend about that much when I go grocery shopping. So
yeah. So and again, my situation was different, but even at $768, I think it was per semester. Money was different then. A brand new car, you could get a brand new car for $6,000 or $7,000, but still, if you look at it, even with the conversion and the wealth, the worth of money, it was a much cheaper thing to do at that time.
Right. And yeah, I think the money is the main reason why there's like a popular debate, is college worth it for people that are, entering college now? My mindset has always been you know, you, and it's unfortunate because most 18-year-olds, maybe 17-year-olds still, like they don't process, at least I believe they don't process, the monetary like size of going to university. At least I didn't. I didn't care like what Quinnipiac costed, to be honest. I was just like, this is where I wanted to be. It felt like home. And then when I got here and started getting older and, started having more conversations about money with my parents, it started to really sit in and like I started to realize that, holy cow, this is a ton of money for me to, have this experience. And that's kind of what fueled me to get more involved in college and like do more stuff with my time, like take on more opportunities. Just because I realized that, it's not a matter of like, is college worth it? I'm already in college, so I made my decision. So it's up to me to make college worth it. You know what I mean? Like I have to, through my individual decisions, make this experience worth the money that I'm paying.
Yeah, that actually, I think, again, for where you are in history for your generation, that is that makes an awful lot of sense as a way to go about it. There was one other thing I wanted to comment on that you mentioned. You talked about your parents, and I think parents play a role that they didn't necessarily have to play when I was younger going to college. And I have a friend who's worked in financial aid at universities, and he told me at one point, he said, I have this thing I do when students come in and they're looking for financial aid, which is mostly loans. We call it financial aid as though they're getting free money. But he said, most of it's not that at all. And he said, when they come in, I say to them, do you know what interest is? And he said, fully 50% of them, either they say, yeah, it's something you like I have an interest in sports. And that's all they know. Or they don't know. And they realize I'm using it in a way they're not familiar with. And he said, I will not let them apply for a loan until I explain to them what interest is and how if you take out a $10,000 loan, that doesn't mean you pay back $10,000. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
You pay back more than $10,000 over a prolonged period of time. So I think, I think those kinds of things complicate it a great deal as well. But like you're saying, it's, if you have parents who are willing to sit down and talk to you about that kind of stuff, you're in a better position, because there are a lot of kids who are, just sort of trying to make the best decisions they can. And I don't know of anybody who can make really good long-term financial decisions at the age of 17 or 18. You're just not there yet. So it's, if you've got parents who could sit down and be frank with you, you're several steps ahead, I think.
Yes, 100%. And I think I do want to talk about kind of like high school and just the education system. But I think that's where the education system has kind of done a pretty bad job as far as financial literacy goes and educating students on, what is money, why do we have it, and, how to be smart with it, especially because in high school, I was required to take financial literacy. That was a class I was required to take, albeit I think I took it my sophomore year of high school. So I was like 15 years old. And I don't remember much from that class except I learned how to like write a check. And that was pretty much it. There wasn't much more deep stuff into it besides like, explaining basic terms. This is what interest is, credit, debit. But it was very surface level. And that was the only one you were required to take. Beyond that, I wanted to go to college for physical therapy. So a lot of my classes were more anatomy, chemistry, physics. I wasn't, making time in my schedule to learn about business stuff. So me personally, I think that's an area where I think high school students especially need to have more education on, especially college also. Like I remember when I was like a junior year of high school, there was just like very like small talk about like, oh, like what schools are you touring? Like what's going on with your application and stuff. And then like out of the blue, it's like, there's 4 months left and you're like scrambling to figure it out. And it was a very stressful time, like the start of senior year, waiting to hear back. And you're kind of like, there's like this mass wave of like pressure to like just go to college and like figure it out and stuff. But there's not like freshman, sophomore year of high school, a lot of like talking about it and like preparing you for like what's to come. That's at least how I feel personally.
Yeah, well, the fact that you had a financial literacy course that you had to take, there are an awful lot of schools who don't even have that. And I have a friend who teaches math. He's an adjunct, just like me. He teaches a couple of courses a semester. And the course he most likes to teach is the applied mathematics course where he is, because he talks to students about things like compound interest and stuff like that. And, you know, how at a young age can you dig yourself into such an incredible hole that you will likely never get out of it? And, hopefully that helps the students not dig that hole. But I'm always thinking to myself, I like to listen to radio shows. I don't know if this constitutes a plug, but I like to listen to Clark Howard because I think he gives sort of practical financial advice that most people can understand, as opposed to some of the more technical folks who are recommending the individual stocks and stuff like that. But, I know in my 40s, I became very aware that people were saying, hey, look, you've really got to start putting money away in an IRA or something like that as soon as you start working. And I first became aware of that in my 40s. And I thought, well, it would have been more helpful if I'd heard that when I first started working. And I think that's true for a lot of people. They sort of become aware much later on. They start hearing the message a long time after it would have done the most good. And I do think, I don't know, education is funny. You always have the division between the people who think that education ought to be as practical as possible, and other people who are much more sort of theoretically inclined, and they're sort of the purists. They think about Plato and Socrates and things like that. And I think there's room for both, but I do think that there are particular elements where we can say, yeah, practical knowledge of this thing would be very helpful. And if financial intelligence isn't one of those areas, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I mean, you can ruin your life pretty quickly,
Yeah.
with not knowing enough about how to handle money.
Right. And I feel like the country as a whole would be much better off if people understood money better. So it's one of those things where it's kind of like, why aren't we? I feel there's no downsides to learning more about it, especially because our education system is very, even in college, I was surprised about this, was the fact that, I went to school, I was in the physical therapy program, yet here I am taking an English class. Like, I thought that was interesting. That, I still had to take a fine arts, I had to take a film class, I had to take a certain amount of humanities. And it was very like, you need to take an all encompassing range of classes with a focus on health science related courses. And nowhere in that was there, as far as, Quinnipiac goes, but high school is the same way. Like, there wasn't any requirements for me to take business classes. There wasn't any requirements for me to take classes that taught me about money, taught me about the economy. There was none of those requirements. Instead, I was being required to read like Irish myths and legends, which, albeit like, I found was an interesting class, but not, there's very little correlation that I could get out of that into, a physical therapy degree besides just reading some stuff and, understanding the Irish myths better.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something else that's kind of interested me. I've ended up doing a lot of weird little things. And one of the things that I do is I do a lot of editing for some of the folks over at Columbia Teachers College in the math department. So I only edit mathematics stuff. Well, I'm an English teacher, so that's kind of funny. Thank goodness it's mathematics education, because if it were sort of high level calculus, it would be a foreign language to me. But mathematics education I can do. But as I've done several books with people over there, and I've edited several dissertations and a lot of articles, and become really aware of issues of mathematics curriculum. And there are these great big fights, as there are in every field. What should be included in the curriculum and what shouldn't, K through 12. And it's interesting to see what people's reasoning is for what we teach them, when we teach them, and how we teach them. And there are strong arguments for a more theoretical approach, because it sort of teaches people to think in a very logical way. I know when I took geometry, for instance, um, it changed the way I thought. It was one of the most important classes I ever took. Um, and somewhat practical because I did some construction, but not hugely practical. Um, but then like you say, the other question, it's sort of the practical value of things is a pretty weighty question too. Um, but I think I notice it more reading about mathematics than English because I'm outside the frame. I'm not a math teacher, and therefore I can kind of see all the things at play, partially because I'm not invested in it. Um, but I'll be interested. I mean, there's certainly there's a big push these days on practicality in education, particularly higher ed because of the cost. But I have a feeling that if it's not already exerting influence on K through 12 education, it's going to soon, because we can't have a system in which K through 12 is one thing and higher ed is something completely different. It just it doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. So I'll be interested to see what happens in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah, there definitely needs to be a smooth transition, because then you're kind of starting from square one again, and it's like, what was the point of everything I did in high school? So definitely need to, there needs to be some sort of bridge between the two, for sure. It was just really surprising to me when I went to college, and it still kind of had that high school class structure where, the reason why in high school you take a bunch of different stuff is so you could figure out why you want to go to college and what reasons. And you go to college, and then it's like the same thing. I was just concerned with, my health science classes and whatnot. And even then, with my health science classes, I had to take like chemistry, and that's probably the best example of a class that I don't think really helps me much as a physical therapist. So it's interesting, but obviously it was a difficult class. I think in some ways it kind of weeds out some of the students who aren't willing to put in the effort that it would take to be successful in future classes. But as far as like pushing me forward in the direction of becoming a physical therapist, I don't know how much, it really did for me. So moving along, I would like to kind of build upon the concept of, we were talking about how the high school, really doesn't do a good job of teaching people about finances, money, and the decisions that involve going to college. And I asked you, like, how many people were majoring in English when you were an English major? There was a decent amount, right? Yeah. Yeah. At least from my experience, I don't know a single English major at Quinnipiac. I don't know a single one. I know one history major, and he's changed his major like 3 or 4 times at his time at Quinnipiac. So he could be something totally different at this point. But why do you think that is? Like, what happened then to now, and why no one seems to be majoring in English and history and stuff like that?
Well, I think Quinnipiac is it's a bad example in one way, because Quinnipiac has always had this kind of pre-professional school approach. So I think if you were to go to other universities, you would find that there would be more people majoring in philosophy and English and history and things like that than in Quinnipiac. So I think the sample in that, if we're going to use Quinnipiac and extrapolate, I think that's a little bit problematic. However, I wouldn't deny that there are fewer people majoring in English, even at Southern, where I went. And I think people are thinking much more practically than they used to be. The other sense that I get is that starting with the millennial generation, it became sort of common sense knowledge, which doesn't mean it's true. It just means most people think that way. To think that, oh, well, the United States, if you were in the 1950s, that was great, because we were our star was in the ascendant and all that kind of stuff. But things are going to be much, much harder. And no longer can kids assume they'll make more than their parents made. And, that wealth in general would be decreasing. And so you have to be much more practical and sort of smarter in how you prepare yourself and then market yourself. And then all this talk about branding and all that kind of thing that came along with the internet. I think that kind of thing changes things. I also think the money issue changes things. The pressure that comes with student loans. And I know, for instance, like I have two sons right now who are going to college. One of them's already there. One of them's headed off this fall, and they're going to Southern. And they're not paying. I am paying a whole lot more than people did when I was going to college. The state used to pay about 75% basically of student tuition, used to offset that much. The state doesn't do that anymore. And so the gap between going to a state school and going to a private school is not what it used to be. Now they're trying to make community college. I don't know how far along we are with this. I should know better than I do, but it's the summer, so I'm banging nails. I'm not reading the newspaper. But they're talking about making community college free. That may change a few things. I don't know. On the other hand, community college for a long time now has positioned itself as a place where people without a lot of money can get their foot in the door of higher education. And people without a lot of money have always needed to be practical. The kids coming from old money and going to Yale can major in philosophy because money's not an issue. But, if you're coming from a family without a lot of extra, then I think that for an awful lot of people in that situation, majoring in philosophy or English or something impractical, whether it's impractical or not, it's thought of that way, has never been an option. So I don't know. I mean, it's it's a strange thing because we can also talk about the idea of extended adolescence, and it seems like in this country, ever since the concept of childhood was invented, I don't know if we had that discussion in your class when you were in my class or not. Maybe not.
Maybe.
Maybe not. Who can remember? It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like to ask students is, when was love invented? And when was childhood invented? And they say, well, those things have always been around, but they haven't. The concepts that we have of those things haven't been around for a long time. Love was invented. I mean, you can go to different sources and find different answers, but 13th century is a common answer, and childhood, either the 19th or the 20th century. And it seems like adolescence at one time was not a thing. You were a child until you could go out and cut wheat and milk cows, and then you weren't a child anymore. Bang, done. But now we have this thing called adolescence, which is a kind of buffer zone between the two, and it seems to get longer and longer and longer.
Right.
And that's an interesting. I mean, if I were a sociologist, I could say something interesting about that, but I'm not. But I think that also plays into this idea of what college is and how people approach college.
We actually did talk about that. I remember now. I remember specifically. Yeah, it's rekindling my memory. But I'm curious what you think of this, because the amount of time that we're in adolescence, the amount of time that we're not like free, totally, like I'll say self-reliant adults, it's definitely longer. I still rely on my parents for a lot of things, even though I feel like, I've never been more free in my life right now. Like, I'm living in a different state than my parents are. I'm, just hanging out in Connecticut. They're in Jersey. I'm going out making my own food, working, making money and stuff. Like, I feel very free, but I know the financial support of my parents is still very much there for me, and also the guidance and whatnot. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, because I heard from somewhere, it was another podcast, but it was a dad, and he was saying that we almost like baby this generation. Like, they almost get too much help, to the point where, like, we as young adults have so much more potential than we think, And because we're like nurtured for so much longer, we don't get to realize that, and eventually kind of just like stay in this state, where we're not like challenged as much. We're not pushed to, survive and make money. And obviously it's like a harsher, crueler reality, but there wasn't like you said, there used to not be a child. It used to be 7 years old and you were out, working all day, and you had to learn really quick, like this is what life is, and you had to get by with that. But nowadays, there's like so much systems that in place to help us and to make sure we follow the right path and the right track and whatnot. But I wonder like how much of it is like almost too much help, and then in the other areas there's not enough help. It's interesting because I see these statistics of there's increasing usage of antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication for young adults, even though this is like the safest generation we've ever lived in. This is like, it's almost like we're helped and coddled so much that I don't want to say we're soft, but like we almost can't handle the stressors that life is intrinsically going to place on us. So I think like that there's like a weird, like I don't think there's enough discussion about that, and how much help is almost too much help, and parents like need to let go more than maybe they're comfortable with. And also it's hard when everyone around you is like doing things one way, and then you might want to do something a different way, but if everyone around you is like raising their kids a certain way, I'm sure it's hard to say like no, like this is what's going to work out best, because no one really knows. It's a lot of just trial and error, seeing how things result, and then moving along with that. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, if I were a sociologist, I would have many more interesting things to say about it than I actually do. I think there's also a socioeconomic difference.
Right.
Kids from the suburbs with parents who are comfortable, that's the parents can do one type of parenting that parents who are a paycheck away from being broke can't do. It kind of makes me wonder, in a way, if the business leaders of tomorrow aren't going to be the kids growing up with parents who are a paycheck away from being broke, because those kids sort of learn to scramble pretty early. My girlfriend actually grew up in Bridgeport, and her family was a single parent family. And she's talked to me an awful lot about, sort of, because I grew up in Easton, Connecticut, which it's not quite New Canaan, but there were a lot of wealthy people there. I mean, my dad was a state employee, and I lived there, and we were one of the poor families. Well, we weren't. It was just a relative thing. But she's told me an awful lot about how it's very different growing up being poor than it is growing up in a suburb in Connecticut in Fairfield County. So I think, the idea of the helicopter parent, and helicopter parent is probably an outdated term now, even, that was a term from quite some time ago, but I think it does describe a certain phenomenon pretty well. And, on the other hand, I think about, my sister lives in Bolivia, and I remember listening to something on the radio a little while ago, and it was someone saying, if your if your children are over a certain age and they're living at home, you have failed as a parent. And I thought to myself, wow, every parent in certain cultures has failed as a parent then, because there are many, many cultures where it's an extended family, and this idea that the kid has to completely individuate and move 8 states away and have no more contact with the parents than to see them on Christmas. It's not a thing in those cultures. So, I think there's a pretty big range. And I think the other thing I'm beginning to notice too is that whatever we've done for a long time, we sort of tend to think as a culture, well, that's the way we have to do it. And this idea that things could be done very differently, we're not too keen on that. I don't know if it's, well, we're Americans, so the way we do it must be the best way because, look at us. I don't know why, but I do I don't look at those cultures and sort of say, oh, well, they've failed. So I don't know. I really don't know if we're coddling too much or we're not supporting enough. But I do know it's different within different subsections of our own population.
Yeah.
So I didn't answer your question at all, really.
No, but and that's fine. It wasn't. It was just what do you think, But that adds a ton because obviously it's not just like a one size fits all thing. Like this is how everyone is. And I find it interesting because I read a book called The Blue Zones, where like this guy who works for National Geographic, he goes around the world and finds areas where the people in this certain town or specific region, they live significantly longer than other people. Usually would compare it to Americans. And like one of the things that was, it didn't matter if it was Japan, Greece, Italy, California, Costa Rica, it didn't matter where the blue zone was. One of the things that was always the same was that there was a really, really strong family tie, family connection. The households, it was great grandparents, grandparents, parents, kids, like all under the same roof. And I find that interesting because they were the ones who were living longer. All these different regions had different diets. They had different, things that they considered hobbies, different religious beliefs. But that was one of the few things that was the same across the board, was extremely close bonds to family. So it's interesting. Like, I think me personally, I have a closer relationship to my parents than my parents did with their parents. But then like, it's like a weird debate in my mind where, is this going to help me in the long run or is it going to hurt me? Like, is there a certain, and maybe it's not just the fact that you're with your parents for extended periods of time. Maybe it's like the nature in which you're with them. What is it that you're doing when you're with them? What's going on day to day and whatnot, because you could live at home but not be home a lot. Like, when I'm in Jersey, I'm out, this is more recently, but I'm out like door dashing and making money for a portion of the day. And then, I go into the basement and sit on the computer for another like 4 hours. And, I'm home and my parents are like right upstairs, but I'm not like directly like interacting with them for the majority of the time. But I just think it's interesting, the family structure that seems to be a main reason why, areas live longer. At least that's what that book draws.
Well, you just said something just now too that reminded me of something that you had mentioned about how you think about college. You're trying to make your college experience worth it rather than determine if it is worth it or if it's not worth it. You're going to make it worth it. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And it also, I think you can apply it to the idea of having relationship with your parents. I mean, a good, strong relationship with your parents, I think, can offer many things. But if you're 25 years old and you still don't know how to operate a washing machine because you're still relying on your mother to do it, then, and I think you have control over that. I think you can say, no, Mom, I need to learn to do my own laundry. And obviously, we're not just talking about laundry here, but you can be with your parents, but also say, I'm going to make conscious choices to not let myself be hurt by this experience because I don't gain certain skills because I'm too dependent. You can be with your parents, but choose not to be as dependent on them. That seems to be what you're talking about. It seems to me that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if a lot of people think about that very consciously, but it seems to me that it probably is something that a person in late adolescence should be more conscious of.
Yes, 100%. I think that's definitely an issue in the thought process. And I don't know about people that are in different generations, but at least my generation, we're very keen on like discovering things, like, or things are just the way they are, and like that's like, we like things to be black and white, whereas I view things as more gray. And you have like love, for instance. People think like you're gonna just like come across your soulmate one day, and then everything will just be a fairy tale story, and you move along in life and everything works out great. But if you know any of your friends or maybe your own family or yourself, like that's usually not how the dynamic goes. Like I view like relationships and love and stuff is something you decide to do, and that's not something that you discover. Like it's a decision you make to spend the rest of your life with someone. It's a decision you make to sacrifice your time to make the relationship better. It's not like this discovery and then like you just like have this subconscious thing and like everything just lays itself out perfectly in front of you. So that's just another way of explaining kind of what you're saying. Like, you know, people need to realize more that you have a decision to make. Like college, it's not something you just discover. It's like an intrinsic thing. Like, it's worth it or it's not. It's one of those things where you need to look at your life situation and what you want to do later. And then when you go to college, or if you go to college, then you need to figure out how you're going to make it worth it. Like it's an individual spark thing that gets it going. People think it's just like, college, you know, it didn't work out for me, therefore it's not worth it for everyone type of thing. It's just like a bad mindset that I think a lot of people have.
We did Cinderella in the class you took with me, right?
What was that? It kind of cut off at the beginning.
Oh, we studied Cinderella in the class that you took with me, right?
Yep.
Yeah. When you were talking about love, I couldn't help but think of the Cinderella thing. You know, this idea that if you're a woman, just wait until your Prince Charming shows up, and if you're a man, well, just there'll be the one, and there's only one, and go around with a glass slipper, and whichever one it fits, that's the one that's kind of intended for you. And I'm kind of hoping that although we still like the story, we sort of recognize it as a kind of idealized thing that we like as a story and not necessarily as a viable life pattern.
Right.
But you reminded me of that very much, with what you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a children's story. Like it's written as a children's story, because it speaks to that kind of, it's a fairy tale. It speaks to that sort of thing that like life is going to it speaks to the ideal of like what your life would be like. Ideally that's how it would happen. There's one person on earth for you, you find them and it's awesome and you guys live happily ever after. Like that's an ideal situation. So you can build a story around that, and that's really appealing to children whose imaginations are, unfortunately I think their imaginations are way better than older people. They're much more creative and stuff, so when they hear stories like that, it, like you can see like their eyes light up and stuff when they read those stories. It's pretty cool. But yeah, I think we need to realize that there's like stories that sound nice and like things that sound nice, but then there's kind of the reality of life and like the limitations of humans. Unfortunately there's a lot more that comes into play than just your fairy godmother coming down and helping you out and everything. I'm curious, and again, I know Quinnipiac's not the best school to use as an example, but I just find it interesting that there's not more interest. I think this is also a flaw, at least in high school, but maybe college also. There's just not like an interest in reading and writing, and then in history. I feel like there's just like I as far as my friends go, I don't know many people. I feel like there's less people that read books. I feel like there's less people that write in journals. There's less people that want to learn about history and read. Like there's so many amazing books from the past that people can read, but there's such little interest in doing so. I think a lot of it is just like technology and the age we're at and social stuff. And, it's not really cool to spend your, Thursday night inside reading a book. So I'm curious, like, at least to me, like, I feel like that's like, if you're able to read, write, and you understand history really well, like those seem like superpowers to me almost. Like if you can articulate what you can think, and you can articulate it well in a manner in which people can then, read it and understand what you mean and then like learn new things, like it's like a really important thing. And I think it's like one of the core reasons why like civilizations kind of advanced was the ability to write things down, the ability to keep records, but there's like less of an interest in that, I feel like.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I agree with you completely.
Okay.
And there are two reasons. One, I think I'm really kind of going in backwards order here, but knowing stuff seems to be less impressive these days than it used to be. Like for instance, I go up and I spend Friday evenings with my stepdad. My mom passed away, so I go up and spend some time with him once a week, and we watch Jeopardy. And it's very interesting because if you watch Jeopardy, all the ads during Jeopardy are for old people things. And I'm watching that, and I'm saying to myself, like Colonial Penn life insurance to pay for the funeral, and all these kinds of things, which are of no interest to people in their 20s. And it's true. I mean, if you look at the demographic data on Jeopardy, it's older people who watch Jeopardy. Older people tend to be more impressed with how many facts you have in your brain. Because if I were to ask you a tough question right now, you would pull out one of those funny little things about this big, and you would push on it, and it would tell you the answer. Or you would talk to Siri or something like that, and she would tell you the answer. And so knowing stuff is less impressive because knowledge is much cheaper than it used to be. So, and I say to myself, gosh, I don't know how valuable it is to know stuff. Maybe it's more important to be able to do stuff with information than it is to know the information at this point, since gathering the information doesn't take as long as it used to. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it might be. The other thing that strikes me is that, you can talk to an awful lot of English teachers all over the place, and they'll tell you, oh, kids don't read. And, you get the very predictable rant. I'm a little less likely to rant in that way because I do see students as doing things that are similar to reading books. Like they'll watch TED Talks, things like that. And I have to tell you, I mean, I'm fascinated by sacred books, as you know from your experience in my class. And I'm fascinated particularly by the Bible because it sort of underpins so much of what we do, so much of people's morality. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, the Bible is old fashioned and, I don't believe in it and I don't base my life on the Bible. But we have these shared values as a culture. And a ton of those come right out of the Bible, Right. Yeah. So people say, oh, no, I don't live my life in, it's not affected by the Bible. Well, that's nonsense. It's just total nonsense. And I like to read the Bible and sort of try to think about its effect on the culture I live in. But to be honest with you, I hardly ever read it. I go to YouTube and I listen to Alexander Scourby's recitation of it. So here I am, the English teacher, and I'm not reading, I'm listening. And part of that is because I got to wear reading glasses now that I'm 51 years old, and I hate wearing reading glasses because it reminds me that I'm old. But so there's a way in which, I'm reading, but I'm not reading, that kind of thing. And there's a lot that's been written too on the idea that print culture was once as new to the world as the internet is now. That there was a time when, people like you and me couldn't afford to buy a book because a book cost a huge amount of money because somebody had to sit there and write it out by hand. And that took a huge amount of time. And it had to be done by somebody who was literate. And there weren't very many literate people. So I don't think I'm not like a lot of English teachers, who would say that if you're not reading it, holding it in a book, it doesn't count. Because I do think that, I think watching a good TED Talk is a kind of reading.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
Yeah. I mean, to prep for this, I was kind of flipping through some of the books that we read in your English class. Specifically, I was trying to read Gilgamesh, and understand it on my own, and it was difficult. Very, and it's an older English. It's not an older English, but the language obviously was different, and then they're translating a different language into English. There's complete sentences that are missing, and then words just don't really resonate with my the way I speak English. And then eventually I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna watch a YouTube video that goes over the story, and I understood everything about the story within like 10 minutes. And albeit I think I enjoyed the video more just because I could actually understand what was going on. So like it's one of those things where Yeah, I think I agree. It's just sometimes it's just a lot easier to just, especially the ancient stories, that they're hard to understand. Like they're difficult reads. I remember from the class, like a lot of the class was just like dissecting like a small block of text. Like what is this actually saying? Because the words are like just like kind of thrown there, and then you can dissect them and figure out what it's actually saying. Um, but for those stories, it's a lot easier to just watch a video and kind of get the gist.
Yeah, it's interesting too because the example you picked out is there are two different issues at play there. Um, One is reading Gilgamesh in translation. People seem to think, well, the older the translation, um, the better it is because it shouldn't be in language that's too easy to understand. And that doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if it were translated, it couldn't be translated into Elizabethan English because it hadn't been discovered yet, but found under a bunch of sand in Iraq. But people, I think, would be biased toward that and say, well, the translation in Elizabethan English is the correct translation. Well, it's still a translation. So I don't have any problems with people reading translations that are in modern English. I think in some ways that's better. But the one thing that I would have an issue with is um, a lot of the versions that you'll see, like there are huge sections of that text that are missing because the clay tablet that it was written on disintegrated, or the sand washed across parts of it, like sandpaper wore it out, those kinds of things. um, and the one thing I would have an issue with is reading or listening to a translation that filled that stuff in, because then you're getting somebody's idea of what it probably said, and you don't know that for sure. So that there are a couple of well-known examples that I've long since forgotten because it's been too long since I've listened to them, but well-known examples of classical music that was half written because the person died in the middle of composing it. And a modern composer will sometimes take that and then make a piece of it so that the whole symphony exists now. But I think for that kind of thing, you need to say, hey, look, this part was written by Schubert, and this part was written by, uh, Samantha Smith, and, in
Yeah.
2012. You have to make sure that people understand sort of what is being filled in for the sake of enjoyment and what is actually what we can know, that kind
Right.
of thing.
Right. I'm curious if you have any idea like how we can make English and history, and you might disagree that this is not something that needs to be worked on, but at least like from my experience, like when I am with my friends, like we don't want to. Sometimes we do, but you know, people don't want to talk about like history when they're hanging out and like grabbing lunch and stuff. They don't want to talk about those types of things. Um, do you think there's less interest in history today than there was when you were in college, or do you think it's about the same?
Um, I would say it seems to me to be about the same. And certain pieces of history, people seem to get very, very excited about. Um, and I don't mean excited necessarily in a good way. I mean, they care about it profoundly. And I guess an example I would give is with the Black Lives Matter movement, really talking about certain things, um, lesser known bits of history. Like there's been a lot of talk lately about, um, what race you had to be to buy a certain house. Uh, there's a long history of this, I know, on Long Island. That if you weren't the right color, it didn't matter how much money you had, you couldn't buy that house because it was written in. Just like you might not be able to buy a house, you might not be able to buy a house in a certain community right now because you're not over 55, something like that, because they want to keep it an elderly community with services for the elderly or something like that. And that kind of stuff, people have been saying, did you know? Because there are a lot of people who don't know these little bits of history. And it's sort of forcing people to think about the fact that, oh, gosh, I guess there have been things going on that I wasn't aware of. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is there, because these things are real. And I didn't experience them because I'm not the kind of person they were used against. So I do see, especially with that movement, I see a very keen interest in certain parts of history. But I think, also, people seem to be fascinated to know where they come from these days too. Oh, I
Yeah.
had my DNA analyzed and I found out that I'm actually Romanian or something like that. And yeah, which seems a little strange to me because I always wonder, if you find out that you're a Hungarian and you didn't know that, what does that mean for you? Does that mean you feel like you have to eat goulash several times a week? I mean, it, people seem to sort of think, it just seems like a strange thing. Like that, oh, it changed my life to find out that, my people are descended from a certain place. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. My whole family did one of those. And we have a good like history of like where we came from. So the results were very, what we expected, but it was still cool. And it actually helped us connect with some relatives in Spain. So it worked out in that manner, but I wouldn't say like, yeah, like the commercials always make it seem like you get, you spit in this tube and like mail it and then like your life changes forever. It's kind of weird.
Well, Saturday Night Live did a bit on that at one point that I thought was very funny. And it just sort of showed people who found out they were from a certain place. And so then they dedicated their lives to becoming walking stereotypes of what people think of that group of people. And every once in a while, Saturday Night Live gets it right and sort of points out some way in which people are really kind of silly. And I thought at that moment they had pointed out a way in which people can be silly. But you know, getting reunited with relatives, yeah, that sounds. I could see the value in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Um, Moving along, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about history, but also just like my generation. You know, it hasn't really sunk in for me at least, like because now I'm 21, so like I kind of have a good concept of like, okay, this is what 20 years feels like. It felt like like really fast, Like I remember from like 0 to 10, like it took forever for me to turn 10, but like every year, it gets faster just because you've been alive longer. So each year feels shorter, but these 20 years, I feel like have gone by very fast, and I'm sure you would agree. Like time, it flies, and I just find it really crazy that there's not more people that really want to like dig into history and like understanding kind of like human nature and human condition, because it wasn't all that long ago that the world was kind of in chaos. I mean, World War II was 80 less than 80 years ago. And like I didn't, when I was growing up, like it's 2000 whatever 6, people are talking about World War II, all the footage is in black and white. It looks like it's ancient to me. And like, but then my grandpa was alive during it, and it's just weird to me to think about that. Like it didn't really sink in until like very recently that holy cow, like if I went back in time just like 4 of my lives, which has felt like a complete like flash, you know, there'd be 100 almost 100 million people getting slaughtered over the course of a couple of years. And like that to me, like that was a huge wake up call. Like holy cow, like I need to read stuff about what happened, so I understand like this happened, these terrible things happened not all that long ago, just so hopefully myself, I can do a better job to hopefully prevent that from happening. At least that's kind of what my mindset was. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Because I just think like my generation is more concerned with how many likes their Instagram post gets. They don't care that barely only a couple decades ago the world was total chaos.
I think part of it, part of valuing history is your connection with it. And you when you mentioned World War II, you mentioned something that eerily, it's very much part of my life. My father grew up in East London during World War II, and just about every German bomb that was dropped on East London because it's where all the factories were, and that's how you defeat a country is you disrupt their ability to produce war material. Um, and his mother had to get him and his brother out into the shelter at night when they heard the air raid siren and all that kind of stuff. So World War II to me seems like it just happened. And a lot of the things about World War II shaped my father's existence. And he came over here as a result. Uh, once he was old enough, he came to the United States, and that's where he met my mother. And if he hadn't met my mother, you'd be talking to an empty screen right now. So, so to me, World War II seems very, very recent and very immediate. I don't know anybody who was killed in Vietnam. So Vietnam feels like it was 800 years ago to me. I just, it seems totally remote. In fact, I was born in 69 and Vietnam was going on. And yet it seems totally remote. So it shouldn't be the case. I'm an American and Vietnam is such a part of our experience and I was alive during it. And yet there wasn't the direct, cause and effect kind of stuff going on. The other thing that I think makes a difference when you talk about history is when you get old enough where things in your life have become history. And I don't think that happens formally, but I do think there's this time at which we begin to look at things not as sort of current or recent current events, but as history. And so, for instance, the explosion of the space shuttle when I was in high school, that's seen as a historical event. I remember at that time thinking it was funny that people would say, "Oh, I remember where I was when John F. Kennedy was shot." And I thought to myself, well, that's a thing in a book. That's not a thing that people live through. This sort of book history versus lived history thing. So, and, now I'm 51. So now I've seen stuff, and now, my students weren't alive during 9/11. One of my best friends from elementary school was on one of those planes with his wife and his 2-year-old daughter, who was the youngest person to die in that attack. And, but my students, to them, that's a book thing. That's not a living through thing because they were born after it. So I think those things make a big difference. And I do think that as you begin to get older, you begin to talk about history more just for that reason. Maybe other reasons too, but at least for that one. And it in a way, I know this might be a little bit of a tangent, but in a way it's, people say, oh, well, religion is in trouble because young people don't go to church. And that means that, in 30 years, there won't be any churches because all the people who are going will be dead. But I think there are reasons that people who didn't go to church when they were young start going to church when they get older. The primary one being that they're scared. Oh no, I'm going to be gone forever. Church is, church, synagogue, whatever it is, whatever your bag is a pretty good way to deal with that. So I think there's a reason that a lot of the young people who don't go to church may very well end up in church when they're older. And that's kind of the way, you've always had to drag kids to church. Very few kids have, yay, church, So, so I think these are things that happen naturally and kind of always have. I think there have always been people who are over 50 who talk about history a lot more than people who are in their 20s because people in their 20s are living their lives and doing exciting things. And people in their 50s are not doing exciting things. I watch a Prime Video at night, and that's an exciting night for me. It wouldn't have been when I was in my 20s.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I remember where I was when the Boston Marathon bombing happened. I was at Chili's, eating some food with the parents. Sandy Hook, I was at a friend's house, and I guess it's interesting because, those are terrible things that are happening while I'm alive. And then, I lived through those, and then, I'm wondering, why are not enough people, or why, not why are not enough, but, why aren't people my age talking about, how crazy it is that, World War II was going on, but there's crazy stuff happening, it seems like, every month at this point, whether it's, this pandemic or really anything. So there's always some stuff going on. There's always some sort of, I'll word it as good and evil going on. There's always some sort of brawl happening. Obviously, usually the evil side views themselves as the good side, and then the good side views themselves as the good side, but, the other side, and vice versa, right? So it's interesting. But I'd like to talk about the class that I took that you taught a little bit. If you don't mind you if you want to give a quick rundown, just like what was that class? What was like the premise of it?
Well, actually, it's a little tricky because they've been doing some things with regard to the curriculum lately. So I've had to change that class quite a bit, and I'm going to try and remember the iteration that you got because it changed quite a bit over the years. As I recall, in your class, we did Cinderella and Cinderella stories from around the world, but different times as well. And one of the big points of that was that everybody thinks that they know the Cinderella, but really the Cinderella to them is the Cinderella that they know best. And that's the real one, even though it's not the oldest one. So, we sort of try to break down what it means for a version of a story to be real. It doesn't have to be the first one. And in fact, probably with most of these stories, there are no first ones because they just change over time. So you have to say, well, what makes a Cinderella story a Cinderella? Does there have to be a shoe? Does there have to be a wicked stepmother? These kinds of things. And I think we asked all those questions in your class. And it's fun to look at things from other cultures because then you get to realize two things. You get to realize that other cultures have similar stuff to us, but you also get to realize with the wide differentiation in the stories that there are more ways to do things than we do. And people have different values and beliefs than we do. And I always would say to students that, look, we started with Cinderella because if we want to talk about myth and we want to talk about religion, fairy tale is kind of the shallow end of the pool for that. You can watch and see different stories and what people draw from them and values at play and those kinds of things. But there's much less at stake. And I always would have students who would see that, I was requiring them to buy a copy of the Quran and get a Bible, and they'd go, oh, what's this all about? I had one student once tell me that her mother refused to let her buy the copy of the Quran because her mother thought that the money would go to ISIS. And it was published by Oxford University Press. And I told her, I said, look, and I didn't even say anything to her about it because, she was trying to honor her mother, and what her mother wanted. And I said, well, what should we do? And she said, can I look at it online instead? My mother said that would be okay. I said, sure, that's fine. So anyway, we started at the shallow end of the pool with Cinderella, and then we got into mythology and religion, and I didn't feel like having any arguments or causing any sort of news stories to go viral about this crazy guy at Quinnipiac. So I didn't draw a distinction between myth and religion. I said, look, these are stories people believe in. I refuse to discuss whether they're right or not and which God is the right one. We're not going to go there. We're not going to do that. We're just going to look at these stories as important stories for groups of people that shape the way people believe, act, and kind of conceive of the world. And we did quite a bit of that, and probably the oldest one we did was Gilgamesh. But we probably also did, oh my goodness. Wow, this is what it is to be 51 years old. Sometimes you want to think of a term and it doesn't come to your mind. The one with Marduk and Tiamat,
Yep.
And the creation of the world. That's also from the same area, which is basically Mesopotamia. We also read big chunks of the Quran. We read the Hebrew Bible. We read the New Testament. We read some of Ovid because that gave us a window into Greek and Roman mythology, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I think we read also some pretty scholarly articles on that stuff as well, giving us an idea of how scholars approach that kind of study. And as I recall, the year you were in, we also did a research paper at the end where we looked at a film as and you had to pick a film that you felt was trying to sort of construct a mythology in some way. And a lot of movies do that. I mean, James Bond movies are doing that all the time. Tolkien-based stuff does that. A lot of students were interested in superhero movies. I had students who did Django Unchained and talked about, okay, what in this is mythic? What values does it display, and what kind of mythical storylines can I see going on in here? And I guess that goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the idea of the practical versus the theoretical. A lot of what we talked about in the class was theoretical. You don't have a lot of worshipers of Marduk or Tiamat anymore. But we ended up by looking at this sort of creation of a mythology using media in our culture. And I think a lot of people would see that as much more practical than looking at several thousand-year-old creation stories from a culture that is now pretty well gone. I guess that's it. I guess that was what we did.
Yes.
Does that seem to summarize it pretty well to you?
Oh yeah, very well, very well. I wrote my final research paper on Lord of the Rings. Yeah, but the interesting thing about your class, and like you kind of touched on this, was like first things first. Growing up, I hated English class. I hated English. I never enjoyed it. I never thought I had a good professor or a teacher. I didn't like it. And in high school, it was like, they'd give you like the vocab book, and they'd say like, memorize these 20 words, and then you'd have to write it down. And then like at the end of you'd do like 4 of those, and then they'd give you like a big one with 100 words, and you had to know all of them. It was like stuff like that. And I was like, really, like, I just didn't like it. I didn't view it as something enjoyable. Like, I more enjoyed just like having discussions about books, and I didn't like it when English didn't do anything else besides that. Like, I liked it when we read something and we just talked about it, which there was a fair bit of that, but generally, like, I did not like any English classes. And then when I had your English class, that totally changed. And like, I'm a tour guide at Quinnipiac. I give tours and stuff, as you know, and students ask me like, what's been your favorite class that you've taken? And I say it's yours. And yeah, and it's because I guess the class and the way you went about teaching it made me not only like enjoy a class that I had previously totally hated, but it also made me appreciate and understand other people's beliefs and cultures without challenging my own values at the same time. It was very well structured in that manner, where me being Catholic and Christian, I could go into that class and come out honestly more Catholic and Christian in my opinion, because I understood other people. I could relate to them better. Therefore, I could, be a better person, and at the same time, like, there's some sort of common ground where I can relate to more people. And I view that as a Christian Catholic thing, being able to, despite, it doesn't matter, you're rich, poor, what you look like, what color you are, what you believe in, we can all kind of get along. That's at least what I view it as. So, your class was great in that way. And then on top of that, I describe as a pretty unique professor, teacher, and the manner in which you teach, because you'd always walk in with your Hawaiian shirt, you'd play music at the start of class. Yeah. You had a very unique teaching style. And I'm curious, where that stemmed from, because most professors, most teachers, it's kind of like very, I don't want to say authoritative, but it's very like, kind of is like that. You're there, they write things on the board, they talk to you, you take notes, you walk out of the class. Whereas yours was much more of discussion based, asking questions, and you had this like casual approach, but yet I still feel like I learned, immense stuff. So, where did that kind of come from, that teaching style?
Probably came from the people I enjoyed learning from in college. Of course, to contradict myself, I learned really well in lectures in college. So, but I know that I also enjoyed classes in which there was a lot of back and forth, and particularly when I went on to get a master's degree. You really, there's less lecturing at you when you're a master's student. But I just like to engage students. If my students aren't engaged, then I'm not really enjoying the experience very much. And if you're doing it on an adjunct basis, um, you're not you're not getting rich doing it. So you better have some other reasons for doing it. Uh, and it's fun for me. I guess I've always enjoyed violating social norms. Um, so a couple of years ago, we were doing a unit on camp in my English 101 class. And we began by reading Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. And, talking about what students had seen that they would say was campy or kitschy, what's the difference between camp and kitsch, all this kind of stuff. And I thought, I want to do something here. I want to go big or go home. And I hired the head of the New Haven Pride Center, who is he has a drag act. And so I had Kiki into my class, and I had a drag act going on in my class, and it was lots of fun. And some of the students were a little, what's this all about? And we walked through the hall at Tater Hall to get to my class, and there were a lot of different things said as we walked through the hallway. Not a lot of drag queens walking around on the Quinnipiac campus, just as a general thing. But I thought to myself, this is something we can talk about quite a bit. We can get a lot out of this, but also it's something that the students aren't expecting. And I think when you hit students with something they're not expecting, you can kind of open a door that wouldn't be open if you tried to approach it from a more conventional standpoint. But part of it's just because I have fun doing it, and I sort of feel like I better have fun doing this job, or I'm not going to want to do it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. In that class, I was aware that the Quran and the Bible, the Quran, I knew the Quran stemmed from the Bible, but I wasn't really aware. And it's also interesting because I grew up, I was always going to church growing up. I was very religious. I still am, but I think in a different manner. But, I had never actually really read the Bible that much, despite considering myself to be a Catholic. I hadn't really dived into it that much. I obviously was familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. I knew Noah's Ark. Those are things that were commonly said when I was, going to the CCD for my church and everything. But I found it really interesting when I started actually reading the books and the texts. Obviously, as far as especially the book of Genesis and the beginning of the Quran with the creation stories and the flood and everything, it's crazy how similar they are. And beyond that, there's so many other books that have a story of the flood, and there's always the creation. How do we get here? Then there's always this disastrous flood, and there's destruction and whatnot. That seems to be this common thing across each. And a lot of the values that I think the Quran, the Torah, Bible, they all teach very similar values and very similar ways to go about your life. But obviously, when you look at it from an external view of the execution of it, there people think of Islam and Christianity as very different, almost like polar opposites. And I can understand that, whether it's the way one faith dresses and then the way another one goes about something, but as far as the root texts go, very similar. And it's interesting to me why there's so much, I feel unnecessary tension between different faiths and whatnot, when you can track it back, Quran, Bible, Old Testament, and then before that, there's Zoroastrian stuff going on that seems to have roots in a lot of this stuff. So it's interesting to me why there's so much there's all this modern day I guess kind of tension with groups and stuff, whereas the texts and everything seem to all be rooted in some commonality.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the idea that sort of the closer we are to one another, the more able we are to start fights over things that are kind of small scale. There's a who was it? I think Emo Phillips was this comedian, a very very quirky kind of, well, I won't say quirky guy. He had a quirky persona. I don't know what he was like as an individual, but um, he does this bit that I like to play, a little bit of stand up. Um, and he talks about going to the Golden Gate Bridge and he sees somebody who's about to jump. And so he has this long conversation with this person and he says, um, do you think that God wants you to end your life? And do you believe in God? And the guy's like, oh, yeah, I believe in God. I'm a Baptist. He says, oh, I'm a Baptist. And he says, well, what kind of Baptist? Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? And he goes through all these sort of divisions. And it turns out the guy is identical to him. And he says, and then I asked him, oh, are you, Northern Baptist, this, that, the other thing, Council of 1850 or Council of 1871? And he said, Council of 1871. So I pushed him off the bridge and said, die, heretic. And and I love that bit because it kind of shows how, especially when you get to politics and religion, people are sort of looking for a reason to say, I'm not like that person and that person is wrong, rather than saying, gosh, I remember hearing Justice Ginsburg talking, for instance, about the Supreme Court. And she said, everybody wants to say, oh, well, they're conservative justices and then they're liberal justices. And she said, we all talk together. And she said, you can take the most conservative justice on the court. And I have voted along with him more than I voted on the other side. And so she's sort of, in that interview, was pointing to the fact that people just love to differentiate to kind of start trouble. And and I think it's true. It's a lot of times we can ignore the ways in which we're similar, which are, there are huge numbers of them. And then there's one difference and, we fight over that. We're like a couple of kids, with a set of blocks or something like that. That's always kind of disappointed me.
Yeah.
Campbell, who we watched in his interview, he says, look, he calls it getting caught up in the metaphor. And he says that, if we sort of look to the metaphor as a vehicle for understanding rather than something we can look at and sort of spawn very rigid dogma to create an us and them, then we do a little bit better spiritually. And I've kind of always felt that to be the case. And people who are very religious probably wouldn't agree with me, but that's okay. There's lots of people who don't agree with me.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar at all with Jordan Peterson?
Why is that name sounding familiar?
He's a clinical psychologist. He's been on like a lot of news stations. He does his own podcast. He has books. He's famous for saying to clean your room before you like criticize the world and stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah. I was gonna bring up, in his book, 12 Rules for Life, he talks about how people like, there's a constant he uses the yin and yang symbol to describe it, but there's chaos, there's order, and then at any one time they could flip flop and like the order could turn into total chaos and the chaos could turn into order. And people like to have order, like they like things to be neat and orderly, and he uses the word predictable. Like when things are predictable, you feel safe, you feel comfortable. And he talks about how that's where a lot of the issues that stem between different beliefs come from, is people don't like it when other people they're not as predictable, because when someone thinks the same way as you, they become a mirror image of you, like they're a copy of you. Therefore everything I'm thinking, I know they agree with, they view the things the same way. So like we have a clear established thing, like this is the way things are, this is the way things have been, and this is the way things are going to go. So like we have a past, a future, and we both agree on it, and that's how things are going to be. It's predictable. But then when you have someone come in and say, oh no, things would be better if they were like this, or the past actually wasn't like that, this is what actually happened. Now the reality I've crafted in my head is no longer a predictable thing. It's more chaotic. There's more variables to it. There's more randomness to it, and we don't like that. We like things to be predictable, and he thinks that's what he kind of talks about, is like a lot of wars and stuff that results from just different ideologies. It's not because necessarily like I hate you and you hate me. It's more so I want to fight to make sure that what I view is as predictable stays predictable, and like the way that we think together. Like they're fighting more so to keep these same idea alive that they all agree on. And the other side is fighting to keep their same idea that they all agree on, and not lose that sense of comfort, that sense of order. He talks about that, and I think that is like a different way of looking at it, but also like a really cool kind of concept.
You know, one of the definitions of myth that we looked at in the class that you were in was from Michael Shermer, who is a sort of very popular skeptic. And his definition of myth relied on a term that has a lot to do with what you were just talking about. The term that he used was cognitive dissonance. We want to avoid cognitive dissonance, and myths help us do that. You just made me think of that.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And I find the Bible and, you know, a lot of the religious texts really interesting because, you know, like in society we have, you know, laws, there's rules, but they're kind of like in these really like boring document forms, right? Where it's just like, you know, if you do this, it's first degree murder, here's what the sentences are. And like you run down the list and it's all like hundreds of pages of stuff, legal jargon and whatnot. But, you know, the religious texts kind of do the same thing, but they put it into storytelling mode, or into this kind of form of, yeah, it's storytelling, but in the manner in that it also delivers like how you should live your life and like what's the best way to go about your existence and stuff. So I've always found that to be really interesting because like the Bible at the end of the day, you know, based off what I've read in it, it seems to be telling stories that when you decipher them and kind of pick them apart, you know, that's where the lessons of life come from, is like, you know, like Cain and Abel, like what happens when, you know, you kill your brother, you know, and you get, God punishes you, bad things happen. So, you know, you can take from that pretty easily, I probably shouldn't kill anyone, because especially someone that is close to me, as then my life will not be the best for the rest of it. So I kind of like how those stories go about it. And I wonder like if there's any way our modern day society could benefit from kind of that same model, you know, or is it like an outdated thing? Because now everything's just like lists of rules, you know, in a document.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you're talking about two different functions of a text. The way laws are written makes them much more useful for administering justice. And I mean, it's fascinating to me. I'm not Jewish, but I'm fascinated by Jewish history, Jewish culture, and you know, this idea that you have, you know, in Orthodox communities, the rabbi is the judge, basically. You know, people go and they say, "Hey, look, we have this problem. This is the way it's happened," and he goes to one of a couple of sources and says, "Well, here's something relevant," but he has to interpret it. You know, and if you're trying to, I mean, suppose you're Judge Mike, you know, and you're in your courtroom and there's a brother who's murdered another brother, and you're trying to decide what the appropriate punishment should be. It's much easier to do it if you're reading a law that says, you know, it can be this number of years to this number of years, and this term fits if the following, if it's premeditated, if it's, you know, this kind of thing. It's a lot easier than taking it from a story, because a story isn't prescriptive in that way. But you're right that the story is a lot more compelling. It's a lot more entertaining, and it's, you know, you're going to get a lot more people reading it. So, I mean, it would seem to me that a lot of children's books fulfill that kind of function in terms of, because you have to know the law to obey it. And, you know, that's kind of one of the functions of parents and schools, is to tell kids, well, you know, in our culture, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And some of those things are pretty true for most cultures. not too many cultures that say, should go around and kill people if they irritate you, things like that. But some of the finer points seem more rooted in history and seem a little less sort of universally moral, I guess you would say. So I do think, that a lot of the movies that kids watch, a lot of the books that they have read to them or that they read themselves, one of the functions of them is to take this sort of legal stuff that nobody really wants to read just for fun, and put it into a format where the person can understand, oh, okay, that's frowned upon for some reason. And it's fascinating to me. I was just talking to somebody last night about how we talk to children about sexual behavior, and what's acceptable in sexual behavior and what's not. And the key there is always, when do you tell them? But that's, we do a lot of that stuff through either telling them directly or through stories and things like that, because they listen better.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's still going on.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I'm always, when I read, especially like the story of Adam and Eve, I'm always like curious, like why did they decide to do this? And we talked about this in the class a little bit, like, why did Adam, react this way? And then like, why did the snake in the garden, tempt Eve and not Adam? Like those types of questions, like those are the things that I find super interesting. I think those are the questions that explain, at least back then, how they viewed like, I guess like the nature of man and woman and things like that, just because I find it interesting. Like, I feel like everything written there is written for a reason. Like there must have been a reason why, the snake went to Eve and not Adam. And like, those are questions that I think are awesome and fun to discuss.
Yeah, well, I've taught a couple of classes for Jewish organizations. I've taught for the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven, and I remember we were going over the story of Adam and Eve at one point. No, we were going over Christianity, some of the fundamental beliefs, and it's interesting because I'm the only non-Jew in the class when I'm, teaching for the Jewish Federation. And one of the kids said to me, "Is it true that Christians believe that the snake was the devil?" And I said, "Yes." And I didn't even know that Jewish people don't believe that. So there's a fundamental difference in the understanding of the story. But you mentioned something there that I mean, there are 1,000 reasons why it's interesting. But one of them is that you said something like "at the time." And that sort of begs the question too, are these documents that were written at a certain time and true for some people of that time, or are these documents true for all time? And that's one of the big debates. I mean, even if you look, it's nice to talk about Judaism because the groups in Judaism are much better delineated in some ways than in Christianity. We have so many, but if you talk about the Orthodox in Judaism, these are things that are true and therefore true for all time. But for Reconstructionism, which is another movement in Judaism, that they don't quite believe the same thing. And that's, there are people who take the Bible very literally, and then there are people who say, well, this is a historical document and things change, and boy, that leads to a lot of arguments too.
Yeah. I'm definitely more, I think the stories, the reason why they're still read and talked about is because there's some sort of eternal life messages like that explain human nature within the stories, and that if there wasn't, then we would have moved on by now. You know what I mean? So that's why I think, and I'm mostly familiar with the Bible, but I think a lot of the lessons that come from it and a lot of the way the stories are formatted just explain human nature, and that's not going to change just because we have technology and cities and stuff. A lot of the human nature, we're still human, just different stuff around us that gets our attention and whatnot. And that's why I like a lot of the Disney movies. I feel like Disney movies, they like tell an entertaining story, but like underneath it, there's some sort of deeper meaning or message. I can go over one real quick. It's Sleeping Beauty, and I always find this interesting. Whenever I say this to people, like especially people my age, and I didn't think of this. This is like something I saw online, but Sleeping Beauty, obviously it's entertaining. the princess, she's stuck in eternal sleep unless this prince slays the evil queen dragon thing, and then he kisses her and she wakes up, right? That's kind of like the premise of the story. It's entertaining, it's cute, it's a fairy tale. Oh, the guy, the knight in shining armor comes and saves the princess. But if you look at it like a deeper level, it's really a story about how to find and it's more from the male perspective, finding a long-term female partner. And in order for the prince to finally awaken the princess and to have her, he needs to first overcome the evil queen, which is like the imperfections of the feminine, right? Like there's the princess who's the perfections of the feminine. She's crafted in this way where she's like perfect, and then there's the evil queen who obviously is female in the story and in the movie, and she obviously embodies a lot of evil traits. And so the prince has to overcome the evil side in order to be able to live with the perfect side, the ideal, the good side. And so like that story is on the deeper level talking about that. And then so as men, as me, the way I do that is I'm never going to find someone, and it could go vice versa, but you're never going to find a partner who's perfect and is entirely good. They're going to have imperfections. They're going to have things that you have to battle with and that you have to overcome. And if you're going to access the good in them and bring that out. So that's how I view that story. And like, it's kind of like a level deeper,
Yeah, no, it's interesting too, though, when you think about this idea, Disney is just so huge that there's a dark side to what you just talked about too. I'm not talking about specifically with Disney, but this idea that you can have a text that seems to be about one thing, and it seems to be about the story, of these couple of people or few people, and it's okay because it's just them. But then there's this sort of statement of values, the ways things should be, that's underneath. And on the darker side of that, it's quite possible for us to run into stories that get widely circulated that have kind of a darker subtext to them. And I have a friend who teaches a class for the Jewish Federation. One of the things he looks at is depictions of Jews. And one of the things he looks at specifically is stuff put out by the Nazi Party. And it very mythical and very story-like. But the message of the story is that, Jews are like rats and they're trying to take over the world. And, and we have to make sure that we keep the population down, or, we'll all die of plague or something like that. So it's interesting, when we use stories as expressions of values, the values can be values that we think of as yielding good results, but it can go the other way too. Or just like Cinderella. A lot of people read Cinderella and they say, oh, good. So you're having a bunch of young girls read stories about how women should be passive and wait for the man to, that's a good idea. I like that message. No. So, yeah.
Right. All right. I have one last question for you. And that is just, I'm curious, what have been some of the most interesting essays or moments that you've had as a teacher? Has there been any essays that have just like kind of had a lasting impact on you that students have written? If you could go in depth as to why, that'd be cool.
I have had students write things that have been very personal at times, and it's allowed me to sort of understand their experience. Sometimes those kinds of things that students write also help me to understand what young people are like. And I'm not a young person anymore. So that's really helpful for me to know. I need to try to keep understanding what the new batch of 17, 18-year-olds are, what these creatures are and what makes them, what they value and those kinds of things. Because at one point, I understood it. I was in a position to understand it much better than I am now. being 51 years old, I have two kids, 18 and 20 years old. That helps a lot. But I have to keep listening. And so I value those kinds of things. Um, I've read so many student papers that, actually, no, I will tell you, there's one student who wrote something to me at one time, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Um, I was teaching high school, and this young man, I let the students write whatever they wanted as an essay, and he wrote a personal essay, and he talked about um, being Black in a school that tracked very heavily, and he was the only student of color in the class that he was in. And he talked about how he spoke to his mother about it, and his mother said, you're doing what you need to do. You're in the advanced class, and this is the situation, and you can be in the advanced class or not. But if you are, you're preparing yourself better. And the school at that time, unfortunately, that meant he was with people unlike him. That was the fact of it. And so he went through that experience. And then years later, I saw him again when I was teaching college. But by that time, I noticed he was always off on his own. And the essay ended with, I'm going to do this because I think it'll lead to a better life later on. But then the last time I heard about him, he had killed himself. And I just keep thinking about that we had something set up at that school where for students of color to get ahead, to be in the upper level classes, they had to be in the white classes. There's been a lot of change in Connecticut public schools since then. But this kid had to make that choice, and it alienated him terribly to the point where, I don't know if that's ultimately the reason that he killed himself or not. I can't know that. But I just keep thinking about that, and I keep thinking about sort of the effects of institutional decisions on individuals and what education should be doing and what it is doing. And that's probably the most affecting essay I ever read because of what happened later. It just made me go back and think about him an awful lot.
Right. It provided a glimpse kind of into what might have been going on in his mind. And yeah. Yeah, wow. Well, with that, I don't have any other further questions for you. Do you have any questions for me?
I don't think so. It's just by listening to the questions and what you've said to kind of fill out the questions and explain the rationale behind them. Again, it's helped me understand the perceptions of a student I once had, but also of a young person, which, like I say, that's an important thing to do if you're trying to teach young people. So this has been useful.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I always get a lot of enjoyment out of talking with someone who has been alive longer than me. They've seen more things. They've been in my shoes in some ways or other ways, and now they're doing something else or whatever it is. But I think my generation doesn't talk enough with older generations, and I've been saying that a lot. I've been generalizing my whole generation a ton, but I do think, especially with my own family, like I definitely need to talk more with my grandpa, and I think other people need to just talk more with people who were alive when the world looked a lot different. Just because it's important insight. History does repeat itself, it seems, unfortunately, with the bad things. I always thought, I never expected a pandemic to happen. Like, it's 2020. Like, we should be able to have our SHIT together enough where like we could not have this happen. At least so you'd think. But clearly, like, that was a wake up call that, like, society. I do think overall, like, the fact that like the world didn't go up in flames is pretty cool. Although obviously there was a lot of tension and debate and stuff going on around it. But it was definitely a wake up call that society, yeah, it's overall it's pretty peaceful. Things seem like they're pretty good compared to the past 100 years, but still a lot of progress that needs to happen.
Yeah, yeah, and don't fault your generation too much, because no generation spends too much time speaking to the elderly. There's life is too exciting when you're young. And so I think you'll find, if you ask people from all different generations, do you think your generation spent a lot of time talking to the elderly and learning the secrets of the past and the wisdom? The answer is going to be no. There are always a few who do, but most are too busy living their lives when they're young. They're too excited about other things to sit down and say, "Hey, Grandpa, tell me some war stories." It's just kind of the nature of young people. I don't think that changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe one day it will. Hopefully. Who knows? All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and speak with me. Again, I really enjoyed it. Good to see you. Good to talk to you.
I enjoyed it very much.
Good. Happy to hear it. Very happy to hear it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.